All right, here we are. We are talking about aquatic biomes today. And as we look at our aquatic biomes, we can see that we're going to start with freshwater and freshwater facts. Of course, you know that only 3% of Earth's water is fresh, and that's a big deal for us because we need fresh water. And actually, very many organisms on this planet require fresh water, from our corn and our trees and our grass to our deer and us. You know, we can't drink the salt water. 75% of all of our fresh water is, of course, frozen in the ice caps. And that's also an issue. But, you know, maybe that's a solution later in life when all of a sudden we're running out of water. We can just melt the ice caps, which could never cause any ecological problems, right? Sarcasm fund. The Great Lakes, of course, our local resource, hold 20% of all liquid fresh water. Over in the African Rift Valley, that's where Africa is actually trying to divorce itself from part of itself. You've got some big lakes here, Victoria, Mawali, and Lake Tanganyika. 27% of our fresh water is there. And in Siberia, there's a lake called Lake Baikal. And that is a very deep lake here. And that's 20% of the fresh water. So you got to look at, of all of the fresh water, you got all this frozen water. So there's 25% of it that's not frozen. And look at what a large portion of the non-frozen water is locked up in essentially 3 locations. So water is definitely a thing that is not shared equally along the planet. But let's forget about those inequities and let's talk about rivers first. Rivers and streams, some people call them creeks. Some people even call them a crick. I know that when I was a kid, we called the one on our farm a crick. Go down to the creek and look for bugs, or cross the creek. Just what we said. Sorry. Maybe we're a little bit of hillbillies when we were growing up. But anyway, flow rate and topography really have a lot to do with the kind of life that's present in your creek. For example, the river in front of my house is largely bedrock. And when I was walking around recently, I saw some crawfish. That's pretty much it. There's not a lot of stuff in the river. You see some little minnows. In the springtime, I'll see a carp, but there's no fish because it's bedrock. The water moves pretty quick. You get a little algae. You don't get a lot going on. So when you look at general stream life, up here in the top of the image is your headwaters of the stream, the place where the stream is formed. Usually, these are going to be fast moving in the beginning, and they are also going to be cold. You're also going to not have nearly as much dissolved oxygen yet. So it's cold. Anything that lives up here needs to be able to tolerate it being the colder water because it's fresh from a rain in a lot of cases, or fresh off a melting glacier. So you're not going to have nearly as many big organisms. As you go down the stream, you get more oxygen dissolved in the water from the bubbling around, and you get, because rapids help mix your oxygen into the water, and the animals that you find get more developed as you go down because it's better living as the temperatures in general get warmer. In a lot of cases, they'll get slower. Okay, you could sit and read this thing. There's a lot of little stuff going on, but don't get too crazy about it. Just know that as the rivers, get younger, they get colder, and that determines a lot of stuff about your river ecosystems. Okay, so let's talk about lakes and ponds. Guess what? There's no clear definition between being a lake and being a pond. Just embrace that. To be a lake or a pond and not just a wetland is that you have a zone where there's too deep for vegetation to stand up. So the cattails, you got emergent vegetation. Out here in the middle, you don't have emergent vegetation. And that's where you really have a definition. This is a lake and not just a wetland. So let's talk more about the lakes. You have some zones. The littoral zone is the shallow zone. You got soil, you got water, you got algae, and you got some photosynthesis going on here. This is your lakeshore. The limnetic zone, you might not have any rooted plants out here. You get some phytoplankton, of course, and it goes as deep as the sunlight can reach. And that has to do a lot with the makeup of your water. In some ponds, you got really clear water, so this could go really deep. In other ponds, you can't see your ankles, and so it doesn't go very deep at all. You also then below it, you have this profundal zone, and that's where you get no light. Usually you get decomposers from all the just debris and everything that falls down there. It's usually a very oxygen poor environment, not a happy place for a lot of advanced animals to live. We also have the benthic zone, and that is the sort of the gooey layer on the bottom of the pond. You get your mud, you get your muck. And yes, it does exist in the ocean as well. Not a lot goes on when you're down deep, but you can have a lot of life living in the benthic zone, where you have more fish and things living. So that's the anatomy of lakes and ponds. Now let's talk about productivity. So this is our Great Lakes. And on this productivity map, you can kind of see a trend. Lake Superior, Michigan, and a vast majority of Huron have little green squares. These are low productivity places. Lake Superior is always very cold. Now, Lake Superior is a good fishery, but it's not the same as Lake Erie. Okay, Lake Michigan, good fishery. Lake Huron, you've got good commercial fishing going on, but it's got low productivity because it's cold and you don't have nearly as much phosphorus. Now, we would call these oligotrophic, wherever there is a green square. Getting into the yellow squares, it's mesotrophic, meaning you get moderate productivity. So, Grandma lives here at the corner of Lake Superior. This is Duluth, Minnesota. And the reason that this has moderate productivity is because you have a river called the St. Louis River dumping out. And the St. Louis River has drainage from all kinds of farmlands in the middle of Minnesota. And so you get some of the productivity, but it doesn't make it far out into Superior before that just gets used up by all the organisms. Then you'll notice Lake Huron. Lake Huron, especially over here, is much shallower. So you have a lot more of the moderate productivity. You got runoff from northern Michigan here. You get some runoff here, so you get the phosphorus. You get runoff up here in Saginaw Bay. You get the phosphorus, and off of Detroit, you get some phosphorus. Or well, this isn't quite Detroit. That's down here. But you'll notice this stuff in the beginning of the Great Lakes cycle, I guess, you don't have as much productivity. Then it all gets concentrated. It comes through Lake St. Clair, through over here to Toledo, and the western basin of Lake Erie is very productive. High productivity. This would be eutrophic. Very high productivity. And guess what? We have a world-class fishing environment in the western basin of Lake Erie. As a matter of fact, when you look at fishing regulations, go west of Vermilion is the cutoff, and they change the rules of the fish you're allowed to catch to manage Lake Erie's fishery. So it's just a different topography. It's very shallow. And you get all this runoff, from agricultural Ohio. You get all this runoff, but as well as it gets concentrated on its way out. And that's what's going on a lot of times with Lake Ontario is you get all this concentration from Lake Erie, Erie, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, and whatnot. And then you get up here into New York. And of course, Canada is contributing as well. And it all flows out. Okay. Let's talk about wetlands. Ignore this right here for a moment. Wetlands help absorb runoff. They slowly release into the groundwater or streams, and wetlands are some of the most productive biomes. Wetlands are super duper important. They are, they're like a storage vessel. They're like the gutter on your house. Okay, the rain hits the land, it runs off and hits the wetlands, and it slows down, and it stores water for the whole system. They also, when you have a wetland that is the benefactor, I guess, of the runoff from the farms. It all comes in there, collects there, and then it makes its way into streams and out. Okay, so let's talk about individual types of wetlands now. Swamps. When you have a wetland and you have emergent trees, you can call it a swamp. Now, did you know that Northwest Ohio has a very large swampy area? Very large swampy area called the Black Swamp. This is a depression from back in the day when the Great Lakes were covered by glaciers, and these dotted lines are glacial moraines. They're the ending points of glacial retreat, and it's been actually it's the lowest parts of Ohio, to be honest, at least in northern Ohio, and it's very swampy. Next, we have marshes. Now, marshes are mostly non-woody, but you'll notice with the marsh, this is kind of environment. You see some deer walking around eating moose moss, having a good time. Not usually too terribly deep, but here, you got good fishing out here in this marsh. Then you get bogs. Bogs are really gross and cool. Again, you get moss and you get some spruces, and they're highly acidic. So check out this sheep. You'll notice the backbone is exposed, and that's what's rotted away, whereas the rest of the sheep is not rotted away. In fact, the rest of the sheep is very highly well preserved. It's essentially pickled. And we've actually had a lot of good archaeological finds in bogs, especially like Vikings, because of just what parts of England are like. They'll find all these old Anglo-Saxon finds in old bogs because they were very well preserved, even like flesh and hair. So that's kind of cool and gross at the same time. Let's talk saltwater. So you get a bunch of different saltwater biomes, and they are equally diverse, but they still perform the same as our freshwater biomes. So you get freshwater marshes and swamps. They do the same thing as our or saltwater marshes and swamps. They do the same thing. And same definition. You got emergent trees, makes it a swamp, or you just have a bunch of grasses and things that makes it a marsh. Extremely productive, these guys are. You get your intertidal zone. This is a very narrow area where high tide and low tide exist. And all these critters in this picture have to be able to handle drying out for part of the day and being in the blazing sunlight for part of the day. Because let's face it, there's no shade on the beach. And so they're getting burnt up in between. So they have to be able to handle that. And that's why you have a very narrow group of species that can even handle this intertidal zone. Then we have everyone's favorite, the coral reef. In case you didn't know this already, corals are a symbiosis between algae and the coral plant. And so the coral builds a colony, this giant bony colony, and the algae live within it, and that's what helps everything just to grow. Coral reefs are one of the most highly diverse ecosystems on the planet. The problem is coral bleaching is killing them all over the planet as well. The algae die, then the coral dies, and it leaves just coral rock behind. Ocean acidification and high temperatures are to blame. So in this image down here, it was a living reef in December of 14. In February of 15, it was bleached out. In December of 15, it was just dirty. And it's really sad. Open ocean. So kind of like what the pond had, you got a photic zone. It's the upper layer where you have enough light for photosynthesis. The aphotic zone is where you don't have photosynthesis, but there's still plenty of light. And then, down here, it's a benthic zone. All the same, it's where you don't have light, you don't have photosynthesis. I guess down here you kind of get some twilight, but it's not. No plants are living down there, and things get crazy down here. You get like aliens living down here. But down in the bottom, you get chemosynthesis, and that's in the deep ocean. Bacteria use methane and hydrogen sulfide to produce energy, so they have totally adapted to their very strange lifestyle of not having sunlight. They can still make things happen and have a whole food chain down there. And this, folks, is the end of our section.